and Andres and I were part of the research committee. So today we're going to have our invited speaker session, because every semester we always invite someone outside of the university to be a speaker in our series. And this time we're going to have Rohan from the Modern Money Network, and thank you for accepting the invitation. And thank you, Andres, for making the contact and having this, to have this session. And also, thank you to the Economics Student Union, because they also support us with some advertising of the event, right? So reaching out, so thank you for that. And we have Rohan today. He's gonna give us a talk called Modern Monetary Theory as a Radical Progressive Research Agenda. And the way this usually works is that our speaker presents like for 40-45 minutes, and then we open it up for discussion with participants to engage in Q&As and discussion, all right? But today we're also going to have formal discussions. So once Rohan has presented to us, we're going to have the comments of Marta Jaimes and Andres Bernal. Andres is our critical theory expert in the program, right? So we're looking forward to listening to him. And Marta is our history of economic thought expert in the program. So that's going to be very interesting as well, all right? So, Rohan, please, the stage is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for all coming out and taking the time. I appreciate this. And thank you to Marta and everyone else for helping to organize this. It's an absolute privilege to be here. I am a doctoral fellow at Cornell Law School. I'm a lead PhD student there. Before that, I was a practicing lawyer for a number of years. Before that, I was a music teacher and a musician in an elementary school and hearing school in Australia. So I have a bit of different backgrounds. And my work, my research project at Cornell focuses on the law of money and society. The internet society being a term of art, referring to the state of being connected to large numbers of people around the world and being able to communicate with them. But I also run the Modern Money Network, which is a research and educational non-profit that promotes public understanding of money and finance. And broadly speaking, we are aligned with and are sympathetic to and supportive of the goals of this group called Modern Monetary Theory, which is what I'm here to talk about today. I'll be talking about, first of all, sort of from how I see it, the origins, intellectual and historical origins of modern monetary theory, or MMT, the sort of state of the MMT union, or the state of the MMT community as we stand today, and then I'll go into the sort of substantive details about what it is as a body of thought, what its tenets are, and then sort of how it stands as a research agenda, and the sort of political and practical implications. So first of all, the origins of MMT. Now, if you listen to the people who started sort of working under the banner of MMT, they would say that the name wasn't something they chose, wasn't something that they think is necessarily the most reflective of their existence and goals, but it actually formed from the internet. People gave them that label in a comment section on a blog, and it sort of stuck, became their identity. And that is significant to me because one of the things about this school of thought is that it began on a post-Keynesian listserv on Usenet in the mid-90s. So it was originally three people, Bill Mitchell in Australia, in Sydney at the time, or at Newcastle nearby, Warren Mosler, who was a hedge fund manager and a banker who had about 30 years of experience in the financial markets and the treasury markets in particular. And then Randall Wray, who was a PhD student of Hyman Minsky and an economist who had taught at various schools in the US, who operates institutionalist Minsky traditions. And so these three people found themselves agreeing with each other in this listserv on issue after issue and on ways of looking at how money works. And over time, they sort of said, well, we should start doing something together because, we sort of see things slightly differently to a lot of our colleagues, even within post-Keynesian economics, even within this sort of particularly financial substrate. And thanks to, in part, the fact that Warren Mosler was a financial practitioner, they had some resources and they organised some conferences. Fast forward maybe another 5 or 10 years, they set up one of the first blogs in the economics blogosphere, and quickly, what up until that point had been a conversation that had been languishing in certain heterodox economics journals and only really discussed amongst other heterodox economics scholars, became a set of ideas that was accessible to people around the world from different backgrounds, different political interests, and suddenly there was an explosion of interest in these ideas, not just from lay people on the internet, but from other academic, technocratic levels of government who found the ideas and the way that they were presenting them and the sort of implications to be very profound on the topics they cared about. So from a kind of online thought collective, a kind of level, a way of collaborating that wouldn't have been possible if not for the internet, you had very quickly, and even in the early years of the internet, the emergence of this school, and from it the growth, particularly after the global financial crisis, where people were looking for new answers. So you needed some sort of external catalyst, but after that happened. And what you've seen since then is MMT for a school of macroeconomic thought, which you could sort of look back and see maybe Keynesianism, maybe institutionalists at certain times, maybe the sort of Milton Friedman groups have had an impact, John Kenneth Galbraith, have had an impact in the public consciousness through popular media with TV shows and other sorts of radio shows and things. But to look at the way that modern monetary theory in the space of maybe a decade has gone from being completely unheard of outside of about 15 or 20 people to having long-form articles written in the New York Times, The Nation, all over European magazines, Australia, the UK, ideas published across different languages, and more importantly, their ideas being picked up by mainstream macroeconomists, monetary theorists. If you look at, for example, Paul Krugman's language on a lot of issues where he and the MMT group differed 5 to 10 years ago, he sounds a lot more like them today than vice versa. And if you look at the way that they were talking about the Eurozone, a lot of people have come to that point of view. So I say this all just as a preamble to say that I wouldn't be here as someone who had no prior connection to this group of economists other than that I came across them on the internet. I had some background in heterodox political economy as an undergraduate, and I was interested in economic justice issues at law school, but my exposure to them came through these sort of popular media channels, and it was only through connection into that literature that it was possible to build the kind of interdisciplinary, applied, politically connected intellectual movement that it has become, far beyond simply a collection of heterodox post-Keynesian ideas about central banking and fiscal policy. So where we are now, there are various institutions that do research on this in addition to our organisation. There's an organisation called Coffee in Australia. There's the Levy Institute up at Bard College that you may be familiar with. There's journals of post-Keynesian economics and things that publish various writings from people involved in this community. But more generally, there is an active network and community that exists across the world working on these ideas that is deeper than one institutional affiliation or whether you're an employee or whether you have a paper published. There are people who get up every day and publish blogs on their personal blogs, make videos, talk to their local Congress people, set up events in their local communities to talk about really dry, dense aspects of monetary theory, of macroeconomic history. And so what you've seen with these body of ideas is a way to tap into a personal level, at a personal level, a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have ever thought this was a topic they cared about. And I know a lot of people here are not from the United States either, but I'm from Australia, and people don't carry around pocket constitutions in their pocket there. Nobody knows the name of a High Court justice in Australia. There's something different in the US about the way they've made some aspect of law in the Constitution accessible to the average person here. It's your law to fight for. We had a revolution or whatever. That idea of making these very complicated technical aspects of society that for a lot of people operate invisibly 99% of the time until there's a cataclysmic event like the global financial crisis, to be able to bring those issues out to a level of visibility that gets people out of their beds every morning to care about this and to read more about economic history and things is in and of itself, to me, a pretty amazing achievement. Whatever you think about the ideas, whatever you think about the politics, it has achieved a level of morality and populism that any group of intellectual theorists who think that there is a relationship between theory and praxis, and that, you know, we can build a better society, and economy should hopefully feel like there's something to learn from. At the same time, as a result of that, if you could say MMT up until that point had just been what MMTers do, you know, if there was 5 or 6 people that identified with that label, broadly speaking, whatever was in their common orbit was what MMT was. Since that time, there has been a generational shift and a generational expansion of what MMT is doing and what MMT constitutes, because and there was an interview with Steve Grumbine of Real Progressives with Stephanie Kelton and Bill Mitchell, who were some of these early developers of MMT, and still, you know, the thought leaders today, where they said, we are academics. Our expertise is not in the messaging, in the polling of the politicians, in the crafting of the minute policy details that go into a legislative bill at the city council level or something. Our job is to provide the piece of the puzzle that we can do, and to hope that others join in and help build this into an edifice that can do something significant. And so, luckily, there has been success on that front. And you have seen a shift where now a lot of people are picking up the mantle and saying, what does MMT mean to me? It means I've learned something about the world I didn't know before, something profound about something quite important to my daily life. And from that, I felt like there are new possibilities that I didn't know existed before that I can have some impact in helping to change, that I feel empowered to change. So it's those 3 aspects of I've learned something new about how the system works that I didn't know before, how the world works, something can be done to change it, and I am able to be part of it. There's the way that these ideas have been packaged, have together created that effect. And so I'll go into, I know I've sort of talked more about it and I've actually given you the picture of what I'm talking about, and I'll go into a second. Just when you hear these ideas, I just want to frame, this is why they're interesting, or to me as a lawyer, interested in change. And I can say over the past 5 or 6 years that I've personally been involved, this has gone from something that exists in the sort of fringe corners of the internet and people who care about this, through to a point where people on the street or people in serious policy circles across a range of issues know and care and understand what that brand means, who is roughly behind it, what they stand for, and how they differ. That's an important aspect of the politics, how close they feel to them. That game of, do I affiliate with this or not, plays itself out across, we're all Friedmanites now, we're all Keynesians now. You know, that idea of building the paradigm to the point where even your enemies identify with your ideas. You know, Margaret Thatcher once said that her greatest victory was building the Tony Blair Labour Party. So when your ideas have become the full spectrum of debate, that's when you've made a serious impact. Okay, I'll stop hiding the ball. What is MMT as a body of thought? First of all, it looks at money not from a priori philosophical assumptions that sort of intuitively make sense from your gut. It's not an economist that stands up like Greg Mankiw and goes, here are 10 principles that if you stopped and thought about it, you'd obviously come to the conclusion that these make sense. It's a set of ideas that are grounded in history and grounded in the best understanding of the way that the legal and financial and technological aspects of money work together. And one of the early developers of MMT, or sort of fellow traveller whose ideas influenced a lot of MMT, Michael Hudson, spent a lot of time working with archaeologists at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, at the British Museum, looking at ancient Near East societies. Other people involved in the MMT research community have looked at ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, Rome. You know, there are people now doing work in South America and Aztec communities, things like that, looking at the early monetary systems there. And what you see across these systems is that there is a point, and this is where the word modern comes into modern monetary theory. Modern here being a reference to Keynes, where he says the state comes in as the authority of law which enforces contracts and determines what you have to pay, the thing that you can pay to satisfy a contract. He says that's been true of all modern states for the last 4,000 years. So the word modern monetary theory there is not 20th century or post-World War I or something like that. It is modern in terms of large, complex, bureaucratized societies where most social relations are not dictated merely by face-to-face interactions, but by formal structures and formal roles. And so we can look at Sumeria, Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, that era. We can look at Egypt. We can look at Aztec or Mayan civilizations or Chinese civilization across the world. When you start to have relations where it matters that you can engage with each other, but that after that engagement is over, you don't necessarily have an ongoing relationship with that person. That's where the essence of this comes in. And what MMT looks at is the idea that the earliest kinds of money emerged as a tax credit, or what we could consider even not more broadly than a tax is any form of liability settlement. So I'll give you 3 different examples. One is a warlord comes in with a marauding band, occupies a town. It says to that town, because we've occupied you, you now have to pay us in our units of currency, the king's head on a piece of wood. And to reward the soldiers who participated in the marauder band, we're going to give the pieces of wood to the soldiers and they can spend it into the village. So it's a system where the warlord gives out the tokens, the army spends the tokens, and then the people in the village do the work to get the tokens to pay the taxes. So in that situation, the tax there is a way of getting the warlord's boot off your neck. It's a way of not dying, not having your house burnt down. So when we think of taxes there, we're not thinking of paying for something, we're thinking of getting relief. So to give another example, or a separate example to that, you have a situation where people have tribes with different families, clans or something, and there's a fight between 2 clans. And the issue is pretty serious. Someone kills someone's brother, or sleeps with somebody's spouse or something. And rather than going to war, what they need to find is some way of acknowledging and addressing the seriousness of that grievance, but also not killing each other in a way that's going to perpetuate further grievances. And so anthropologists who looked at this talk about almost a sort of transference of energy, where the grievance in one space of a blood grievance or a kinship grievance gets transferred into a more impersonal form of either ritualistic or economic grievance that can then be paid. And once that's paid, you can then sort of heal and come back together. And it's a fiction. It's a fiction in the same way as getting justice for having your child murdered by putting the person in jail is a fiction. It's a fiction in that it doesn't actually, both sides of the transaction don't ever actually equal out. Nobody who would want to put someone in jail for 80 years if the cost was to have their child die. They don't think of it that way around. And so what you're doing in this situation is creating a fiction to resolve a social tension underneath. Now, in the case of the marauder, it's a hierarchical relationship. The people's interests on the ground aren't really taken into account. In the case of the clans, you might have a tribal elder or some neutral third party whose job it is to make that agreement as peaceful and convivial as possible, a sort of mediator or something. But in both situations, the point of the monetary system is to keep score. It's to keep track of all the different things that are going into this equation on both sides and give them some commensurability. So people like David Graeber have talked about this in the early origins of debt, where in kinship or gift societies, people say, I owe you a favor, I owe you one, and then you might do them a favor back later. It might not be exactly equal, but that's okay. That's the nature of relationships. That slight inequality is what means you're going to come back to the table the next day. So in fact, in that situation, if you offered to pay someone exactly what you owed them, down to the cent, that might be considered very rude. That might be considered an example of you not wanting to have any relationship with that person after that, or that you don't want to be indebted to them in any way because you want to keep them at arm's length. And so going from that society where being slightly indebted to each other in some way, you gave them a cow last week, they gave you 3 chickens, whatever, you baked them a welcome lasagna to the neighborhood. That idea is what keeps the social glue of a community, or at one level forms a social glue of a community. What happens when you bring in formal processes and start keeping score is you turn that vague feeling of fairness into something precise that can be quantified. You say, you did this thing to my family, you killed my child, the law says that's worth 10 cows or 10 bushels or whatever it is. If you don't pay me exactly 10, we're going to war. We're gonna have a fight. And so by going from informal relationships to formalized rules of debt, you start to bring in a level of enforceability that didn't exist before. And secondarily, you bring in a level of disembodiment. Because if you can have a thing that's worth 6 cows, and I can have a thing that's worth 6 cows, maybe yours was embezzling from the local granary and mine was fooling around, on Friday night, but because they're both worth 6, we can start to weigh them against each other. And so that act of pricing different sins or different transgressions, or even pricing just what people want to buy. In the case of the warlord, it's whatever the army chooses to buy. If it's booze, if it's food, if it's lodgings, whatever it is. Those prices are something that reflect a value structure. So what we get to with modern monetary theory is that money begins with enforcement. It begins with a concept of a formalized debt, not an informal debt, that can then have a quantity that is commensurate. And that from there, we start to build in this idea that yours can be like mine. My credit can be like your credit. And then what you have from the top is an entity that says, my credit is going to be the credit everybody needs. As long as you're under my jurisdiction, everybody is going to need my credit at some point. And the MMTers talk about that as taxes driving the value of money. They don't say you need taxes. And by the word taxes, we could mean fees, fines, tithes. Could be your electrical bill, or your cable bill, or your phone bill. Right? If you have to pay your phone bill to use the phone system and everybody in the world is attached to the phone system so that it's basically impossible for you to survive without oxygen if you're not on the phone system, you have to participate in some level in that economy of whatever you have to earn to pay your phone bill. They talk about taxes driving money. The other idea that they talk about in addition to that is the idea that anyone can create money. The challenge is to get it accepted. And so here is where that other side of the coin, so to speak, comes in, which is that price list. Someone can set those prices, but everybody else can have their own opinion internally between them about how they want to value things between each other. So say, for example, I create a price list as the criminal law, elder in a village, with cutting off someone's hands, stealing water, not doing your chores, whatever it is. Other people could use that price list and make up things that they think valuable relative to that. I'm not selling pots and pans, but someone else might sell pots and pans at a price relative to that price list. So the ability to have an influence on prices is not just set at the top. That is a big part of it, but everybody can have a role. And when you start doing that, what you start realizing is that everybody has their own internal value system. Everyone has their own internal unit of account that may or may not match up exactly to what other people think. So if you think this is more valuable than something else, that's what you're going to want to give more of your resources for. In the context of issuing debts, that might be something you're willing to go into debt for in order to purchase it because you think its value is worth more. So this question of how much you'd be willing to borrow from someone else to buy something you think is valuable becomes a game of you betting your value structure against other people's. So if we think of money as circulating debts and credits, on one hand you have the government or the state or the authority. It could be a religious authority, it could be a state government, it could be a warlord, setting a unit of account. Like we set degrees and inches and meters. There's a reason why we use feet and miles here, and they use meters and kilometers in other places. once you set that up, the individual circulating units, the debt units, can vary in price depending on who issues them. And they can vary in acceptability depending on who issues them. So we get a kind of hierarchy. And you see this in modern finance with your IOU. If you go to a bank, you hand over your mortgage note, the bank gives you its IOUs. But it's nice to have a bank's IOUs because you can use them to pay for stuff. No one's going to accept your IOU in the same way. And alternatively, you could get cash out, and that would have the Federal Reserve Bank or the Treasury signature on it, and that would be a different form of IOU. And here's where the moralism comes in, because this is just interesting to talk about money, and it's helpful to know. And one thing that comes out of this is that money is something that gets created through interrelationships. It doesn't get mined out of the ground, right? It doesn't mean that right now you could set up a debt relationship with each other. You could borrow something from you. You could borrow something. We could create a whole bunch of monies in this class right now without having any access to any government money outside or any external money. So as a result of that, we can't keep thinking of money as this fixed quantity of stuff that exists like a pool of water or a pot of gold, where there's a finite amount of it. We have to think of it like people owing each other favors.
Is this a class or a separate event?
It's a separate event. It's a research working.
Yes.
Yeah, welcome. We have to think about it as something that we can all create. Imagine if everyone in this room wrote, I owe you 10, insert your name here, dollars. Now, you've got money in this room. How much someone wants to buy that off you depends on how much someone trusts you, how much someone trusts that it could be enforceable. But the basic idea that you have a piece of paper in front of you with a pen and you can go into debt, you could enter into a contract, means that you are engaging in a form of money creation, credit creation that affects this broader hierarchy. But where the rubber hits the ground politically is you start to think about the question of unemployment. What does it mean to be unemployed? The definition, you can come with a bunch of definitions if you want to, but the definition that we work with in the MMT world is unemployment is something that gets created when you are in a state of wanting to earn money but not being able to earn money sufficiently or under the conditions that you find acceptable. Now, that doesn't, I put those qualifications in at the end because you could be under conditions of having an opportunity to participate in slavery. You could say, I don't want to do that, and we should still recognize that as being a state of unemployment. There are some people that will say, unless you take every form of degrading option available to you, you shouldn't be considered unemployed. What we could say is unemployment is the state of wanting to do real work or wanting to earn money for doing something meaningful, but there not being an option available to you that meets that satisfying standard. In that context, what becomes really clear at a sort of basic level is unemployment means lack of access to money. If I could pay you to do something, that's a form of employment. Doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about that as being valuable. You could be my personal assistant, you could be an intern at my organization or whatever. Doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. If I think it's valuable enough to pay you, you're considered employed. What that means socially is whoever is in the position to pay people is in the position to determine what counts as employment. We could get Marxian about it and say, in a situation where you can't sell where you don't have access to the means of production, you have to sell your labor power. Usually that's to someone who owns the means of production. That's a capitalist. What we're talking about is taking that story and taking it to a level of monetary analysis where we're saying means of production in this context is simply money itself, and who doesn't have access to money. Well, in this case, the government does have access to money because we're talking about a story where the authority who is enforcing the law, who's at the top, is the entity that creates the monetary system, that creates the monetary unit of account. So we're identifying a villain and identifying an injustice. The injustice being, if you would like to work and contribute to the common social enterprise, you should have a way to be able to do that at all times. Now, that's a principle that sounds pretty hard to argue with. You could argue about the details, about the logistics, about whether we could find something valuable. But that basic principle of anyone that wants to be productive or helpful should have a chance to do so is pretty hard to argue against. Even conservatives talk about being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and the value of work and personal responsibility. But it's hard to keep that narrative up when you are acknowledging that personal responsibility isn't enough when the structural forces aren't giving you a chance. So note, this isn't a story that's locating unemployment solely in the employer-employee relationship in terms of private capital. This is a story that is different from that Marxian story of a private employer who owns the factory and you can't access the factory. This is a story that's putting unemployment at a deeper level, at a monetary level, and saying, we've had slave societies in history, we've had feudal societies, we've had schools of fish that work together. None of those societies have had to deal with a pervasive and persistent problem of involuntary unemployment. We didn't have the problem of large sectors of society looking for paid work who couldn't get paid work. Some people wanted access to land, some people wanted access to rights, some people wanted access to other things. We didn't have a condition pervasively across those societies where people were looking for paid work and there just simply wasn't enough. That is a feature of a monetized economy. Now, you can have monetized economies where there are slaves. Edward Baptiste has talked about that in terms of the American Civil War. You see that in terms of Roman history. But the slave economy itself operates under different principles within the slave economy. A slave doesn't wake up in a household and say, oh, I don't have enough work to do today. I'm unemployed. My boss isn't giving me enough labor to do. The problem of wanting to do more work to get more money is one unique to a monetized economy. And so when we take that idea and we put that moral critique at the heart of the monetary system, we are bypassing capitalists in saying it's not their responsibility to provide full employment. It's a responsibility of the monetary issue, the monetary issue of being the sovereign. Therefore, we are not blaming them, we're not putting them in the driver's seat, we are saying we can fix this problem independent of private capital. And that is the empowering aspect, to go back. There's the thing you've learned, is about how money works differently from what you've understood. There's the problem that can be fixed, which is that we could fix involuntary unemployment. And then there's the empowerment, which is this doesn't require us to be able to storm the barricades and take over Nestle. This just requires us to use the budget tools that we already have available to us properly and to get out of our own way. So it shifts the narrative from scarcity to abundance. It puts the focus on a level of technicality, on money and finance, on the guts of contracts, of debt relationships, of accounting. It takes economic narratives about profits and surplus and things that can use vague categories and forces them to come down to the level of national statistics, income accounts, flow of funds analysis. If in the same way as when you talk about a grievance and then you talk about a legal claim, there's a different level of empirical granularity. I'm not saying that everything that is abstract can be reduced to those concrete legal claims, but it is different to say that something is unjust and to say that something is illegal under Article 3, Section 8 of this particular statutory provision. It's a different kind of utopianism or a different kind of theory of social change. And so the last point I want to talk about is sort of what it means as a progressive research agenda, because why it's important to understand where we're at on this is to understand where we're trying to go. And what I think brings people together across the internet, across different academic disciplines, across political movements in Europe, in the US, in Asia Pacific, in Latin America, is that these ideas answer questions that are currently the questions the progressive or the left is losing. This is the hammer that enables you to fight back on the issues on which we always get defeated. And so if you look back on going back to this country, Jimmy Carter, but particularly Bill Clinton, the classic line was, this is all great, but how do you afford it? And then it was, government can't do things effectively. And those two ideas, with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, the neoliberal turn, there is no alternative to we don't have enough money, and even if we did, we were too incompetent to do anything about it. What I think MMT gets to the heart of with those two is, one, we always have enough money, the only question is how well we use it. And then the other question is, we can't not be responsible for unemployment. We can't punt to private markets, to private employers, to private initiative. because structurally speaking, they are not in the position to do anything about it. It's like the umpire going onto a football field and saying, hey, it's the other team's fault and problem that I'm not enforcing the rules properly. Right? It's the other team's fault that I'm biased or that I've created a crappy game. No, you're in the position of the umpire. You have to take responsibility. You are the only one structurally empowered to do something about it at the level it needs to be done. So where are we at with the research agenda? One thing that we've seen is that, to be frank, economists aren't always great at every other discipline, which is true of every discipline. So when people have started saying, oh my God, this has radically emancipatory potential, what does this mean for the environment? What does this mean for gender dynamics? What does this mean for imperialism? What does this mean for law? What does this mean for the future of technological development? And so suddenly, what started off as an insight about money and about macroeconomics and about central banks and about tax policy has become a story that needs to keep going and needs to answer everyone's possible objection. Because once those objections are answered, people are saying, all right, I'm on board. I'm going to jump on board this team. This is a good agenda. I support it. What you're doing is trying to work out all the different points that you need to persuade someone that this other world is possible, we should do it, and that at the very least they could support it. At the very least they could be a part of the project by just not being in the way and saying they think it's a good idea. Obviously more would be appreciated, but that's the very basic thing that comes across. So what starts as a conversation about how the world works becomes a recruitment drive in one level. And what people say is, well, I'm not convinced about X. And so part of that process is, what do we need to be able to answer to get people through the levels of skepticism? And so some people say, I'm concerned this is going to be make work. I'm concerned the government can't allocate resources efficiently. I'm concerned they won't know when to turn the tap off with financial spending so that you'll have inflation or depreciation. I'm concerned that this is the kind of thing that's going to reinforce existing hierarchies because the jobs are going to go to the men, the white men, the citizens, the documented workers before it goes to other people. I'm concerned that this is going to reinforce a division between hard work like infrastructure and soft work like care or the arts or community. I'm concerned that this is going to come in bearing paternalist, benevolent tones, and it's going to create another social panopticon or a governmentality, of the kind that other social welfare systems have further ensnared people into bureaucratic lives. All of these are really important issues and concerns that come up, and they require people with expertise beyond that original group to answer. And so you start to see public policy students coming in. You start to see bankers coming in and saying, I can provide that little bit of the puzzle that you need. If someone says, well, how the hell does this fit with how the stock market works? Stock market traders can come in and help. Someone says, how is this going to work in a way that brings on board indigenous communities that don't have the same understanding of sovereignty and its relation to the land? Okay, we need to think about that and incorporate that. And so this isn't an idea that MMT becomes all of those things, but it becomes a way to start connecting different stories that might not seem to be connected today. And so why we think this has the power to do that is, again, going back to that neoliberal turn, those two overarching questions has been what has crushed everything. We can't afford it, and even if we could, we couldn't administer it properly. Whether it's environmental reform, whether it's public schooling, whether it's public funding, public investment in the arts, whether it's any form of infrastructure that we could think about, any form of putting an American version of the BBC together or something. God forbid, how can we trust the government to invest in the arts? When we look at the question of the money, always has to come from somewhere. So we're going to go start to that point of the conversation. And then secondly, what are the things that we can't avoid the government doing? And because of that, we don't have the option on the table to push it to somebody else's problem. We have to face the hard question of self-governance with these issues. And that's where we start our story, and I think that's where we can kind of take it on beyond that. So I've talked for ages, and I'll stop now, and hopefully we can have a conversation now. But feel free to throw, don't be nice and throw stuff at me. I'm happy to hear how it goes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rohan. the intervention of our two discussants, Marta Jaimes and Andres Bernal. Please.
Okay, so I have just like a general question. You are talking about the policy agenda or how it will go forward. So are there any like concrete proposals that people are working on? And that's like a first general question. And then from the overall perspective, I have the feeling that there's still a proposal at seeing the government as something that is outside or a different entity. And it's not recognizing like the politics and the struggle for power that might be within that government. So it's like there might be a kind of knowledge that it's already there, but this power doesn't want to like sort of like let it go or go beyond what's being done right now. So in terms of, for instance, social policy, like if the matter is affordability, yes, we can afford most of the social policy, but then what would be the consequences in terms of having this employment struggle or this demand for the money that, or that this like artificial creation of scarcity in terms of money and employment, if we already provided certain like a basic social protection for people. So what are the thoughts? Like I've seen that you have some sort of like advancement in terms of jobs guarantee and this type of discussions, but what about this other side that could sort of like cut the idea of scarcity or the need and demand for that money that the government provides? So that would be sort of like my points there.
Cool. Do you want me to respond now or do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, these are really on-point issues. So in terms of the policies, I mean, I think the first policy is the job guarantee. And the idea here, again, the reason I wanted to be as sort of basic in what I was just describing is because there are a lot of different variations of what a job guarantee could look like. A lot of people have different MMTs. To go back, if MMT is what MMTs do, there's different MMTs with slightly different visions of what they would do with the job guarantee. What I think is the commonality, and again, going back to what brings people under this rubric, is the idea that at a basic level, if somebody says, I would like to participate, I would like to be a part of things, that is not devalued, that is not excluded. How you do that, I think there's a quite wide scope of disagreement and conversation. There could be direct government programs, it could be a check to other entities, it could be some power sharing arrangement. There could be a whole range of ways to structure that program depending on how much of the public sector narrative you want to embrace and have central to that vision. But what you're doing across all of them is you're saying involuntary unemployment is not okay. Now, I was an elementary school teacher. Just to give a very crude example, my old elementary school had a bench where you could go sit on this bench if you didn't have any friends at lunchtime, and someone would come and play with you. And there were other things where, there were games that everybody had to be selected. If you set up a system where you say it doesn't matter if you exclude one kid and people exclude one kid, that is a different choice you're making as someone who's setting up an educational space. Now, we could be dismissive and condescending and say, well, that kid who sits on that park bench doesn't have real friends, they're just being nice. We could really make the focus of the conversation about how that person's really a loser and how we really aren't helping them and whatever. Or we could try to focus on what the point of that exercise is to create a culture of participation and inclusivity and say, if we train everybody from the age of 5 to look over and see the one person who's not involved and to bring them in and find a way to make them a part of it, we can do that. We can make that commitment. And that's just a different theory of schooling. Once upon a time, we put all the black kids on that bench and didn't let them play with everybody else. We don't have to keep doing it the same way as we did in the past. So the job guarantee at its core is not one bill. It's not you have to be pro-public sector. I think it's accepting that moral choice is unacceptable and not a part of any labour market system we're going to continue to tolerate. The broader question about how money works goes into things about abundance and scarcity. It's not saying there's infinite money. You can do anything you want. Put anything in your shopping list and everybody gets a pony. Although Stephanie Kelson had a great article about how much giving everyone a pony would cost. I think it's more feasible than some projects you could imagine. But the idea of saying the question of scarcity is not a question that comes on the front end. If we say we want certain parts of a society to exist as a basic feature of the society we've created, we can create them. We can make them a permanent feature. Nobody says we don't have the money to build enough military equipment to defend our borders. Nobody says that. Nobody says we don't have enough money to make sure the Supreme Court has electricity. Nobody would say that. They might try to shave away every other part of the court system out of the public eye, but they would never dream of letting the Supreme Court not have its lights turned on, because we've agreed as a society that that is an institution that we want to keep going. So I think the point about MMT's understanding money is not that there aren't trade-offs, not that there aren't things that we have to recoup, or people who have too much money that we should take away from, or inequalities in purchasing power and economic power that we should address. It's saying, when you start with the infinity sign, you write down a list of things that are essential. Once you put that in, then you deal with the question of the distribution of money and things, but you don't force essential services, essential infrastructure to be conditional on this question of whether or not there are enough resources. If you don't have enough people who can perform open heart surgery in your country, you can't pay for open heart surgery. Money doesn't create an open heart surgery where one didn't exist. But money can be saying that if there is an open heart surgeon who wants to do work, or if there's someone willing to sell an hour with an open heart surgeon, you can buy that from them. And you don't have to be limited in that. Now, in terms of the governmentality, I think this again is where MMT as a political project expands. You don't have to have one theory of governmentality here. We can look to the lowest common denominator as what has to be done and say, okay, we can have that debate. How can we design institutions that are least prone to abuse, least prone to manipulation, and we don't have to think of the government as something over there. We can think of, in the same way as we think of the financial system as being part private and part public, or we can think of us all being involved in the act of reproducing laws and things, but asking the right questions of what we need to do, I think is what the focus is being brought with the MMT analysis. I don't know if that answers what yours.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Rohan. My first question is around the debate right now that exists between the jobs guarantee that comes from this modern money theory perspective and the UBI, right? The universal basic income. And so I was wondering if you could kind of clear that up a little bit about where this perspective stands. And then also one of the things that I've heard that I find really fascinating is that the MMT perspective and the jobs guarantee starts to attempt to transform the nature of work itself and how we understand work as a society. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and sorry, I just remember the one other thing I wanted to mention, which was about power resisting this, and what would happen when power understands how this works. Donald Rumsfeld knows how this works. How does he resist? And this goes to this question about UBI as well, which is one of the things about the theory of change here, I think, is that it isn't utopian. It isn't trying to go nowhere. It isn't trying to tell this story just for the sake of telling it. It's telling it because it thinks it actually has an actionable moral claim. I don't know if anyone's watched the recent young Karl Marx movie that just came out, but one of the points that they sort of focused in on in his life that they wanted to emphasize in that movie was taking these idealistic, moralistic socialists of the era beforehand and saying we need to be able to develop a program with a vehicle of change and identifying the industrial proletariat as that vehicle. What we are talking about here is unemployment, involuntary unemployment, is an essential feature of capitalism as it exists today. The threat of the sack, the threat of being unemployed, the threat that there is always something worse out there than what you have right now is an essential disciplining feature of the way that we think about work. So because the moral claim of if I'm forced to be in a monetary world, I should have a way to earn money is so fundamental, even the conservatives can't argue with it, we can take that idea and say, okay, everyone should at least have access to a way to earn money. And as a result of that, you can undercut the idea that unemployment is some natural feature of the world. Unemployment is something we're choosing to create, we can choose to uncreate it. In a world where there's no involuntary unemployment, that doesn't mean we solve every labour problem, but it does mean that the disciplining power of involuntary unemployment and the threat of being part of the lumpen proletariat is always worse than being part of the proletariat. That goes away. And whatever comes after that doesn't operate under the same conditions of capitalism as it has operated today. So, yes, there is going to be resistance. Yes, the people who currently get the blank check from the government for financial bailouts and for military spending aren't going to want that to go away. But we think, particularly at this moment in history, after the crisis where there's finally a resurgence of a kind of populism on, unfortunately, both sides, this is an actionable political agenda to say we want jobs for all. Comparing to the UBI, I don't think it carries the same moral force. I think people who are post-work, they think that labour is inherently exploitative, they think that any system of labour relations is always going to be dominating. Those people are already convinced that capitalism is a problem, and the idea of giving everyone a check is a way of saying we can never hope to fix the inherent problems of the labour market, let's just find a way to give people an exit. What you end up seeing there is the only way you build a so to speak, cross-ideological alliance there is with people that want to gut the safety net, and they don't want to keep every other program, and they see giving people a check as an alternative to public provision. So I think that to the extent that there's an anti-capitalist UBI, that exists without broad support. That exists for people already convinced of anti-capitalism. Within that, there are two problems to me. One is giving people a check and saying that check is going to purchase a minimum living standards, in and of itself has no internal theory of where that stuff that is being purchased comes from. There is no theory of production, there is no theory of who is making the housing, who is making the schools, who is making the food, who is making the art that's being purchased with this check. And depending on who you speak to in the universal basic income advocacy space, some people say, well, we're going to have radically transformed institutions. People are going to take their checks and start working out new volunteerist, coordinated, decentralized methods of production. Other people say we're just going to let Netflix and Amazon and Walmart continue to do its thing and we'll socialize the stock market and that'll fix the problem. We'll just give everyone a dividend from all these companies. There aren't really coherency to the theory of what actually happens to production. It's a theory of consumption, demand-driven sort of liberation from the labour market. And call me old school Marxian or whatever, but I think that the means of production and control and access to them is what's critical. Now, we are talking about doing it in an indirect way through the monetary system rather than just sort of storming the port in the factory. But we are still acknowledging that you can't have a theory of liberation of workers without a theory of who's going to do the work and how that's going to be distributed equitably. And what you end up having with the UBI, in addition to the fact that I don't think it can promise real liberation to all workers, because someone's going to get up and do the work. It's usually going to be people from the global south or people who are currently marginalizing existing work systems, or people who go to anarchist spaces and are the ones who do the cleanup and everyone else leaves. These reproduction of informal work hierarchies happens in all sorts of spaces. What you're going to see is, with a basic income, the people who need it for consumption are going to consume it. They're going to be marginally less economically unfree than they were, have a bit more breathing room. The people who don't need it are going to invest it. It's just going to go on top of their investment portfolios, earn them a higher yield, increase that inequality between the people who have investment assets and people who only consume. And there are going to be a lot of people for whom this is going to be the stick that justifies even less social care and social investment in their well-being as workers, as people who need assistance. You got your check, shut up, sit down, stay on the couch. And I don't think that inherent in the idea of we have a right to an equal share of consumption without talking about production. I'm not saying they need to be linked. I'm not saying everybody needs to produce to have a claim on production. That's not what I mean. I mean that if you want to claim that there should be a pie, you need to have a theory of who's baking it and why. And that's where I think the job guarantee is more emancipatory and more empowering as a political program, and also locates the change in a class of people, that being people who have a moral claim to access to work who currently don't have it.
Could you speak a little bit to the kind of work that you feel we should want the jobs guarantee?
Yeah.
And how that would kind of affect the economy in general.
Right. So there was actually just discussion recently amongst a couple of different job guarantee advocates about whether we should drop the old term employer of last resort. This was a term that was created to sort of mimic the idea of a lender of last resort in central banking. So if we can purchase treasury securities as part of open market operations and set a price range for that asset, we could set a price range for the asset of unskilled labour by establishing a market and doing the equivalent of open market operations. So we could be an employer of last resort or a lender of liquidity of last resort. But I think a lot of people in the job guarantee space, maybe some of them still disagree with this. Maybe they're saying this for different optical reasons to be a little bit more coy. Some people talk about it as a transitional job. Some people talk about it as a thing that should be there as a permanent option. Like, if you could always go back and work on the family farm, or you could always work with your family's business for an hour or something. That is a different thing to have as a fallback, even as you go out in the world and try to make your way. So some people think of it as purely transitional. Some people think, well, if you wanted to keep doing that for the rest of your life, that'd be fine. If you wanted to just be on the basic wage and you were comfortable with that and that was where you want to stay, no one should have to kick you out. And so instead of the idea of an employer of last resort, the way that we talk about it now is there are a bunch of functions that everybody is in agreement at this point in time that are important government functions. Military, courts, healthcare, education in some countries, sewers, electricity, whatever. And then there's a bunch of stuff that we are letting quote-unquote markets or private initiative do. Then there's a bunch of people who are left behind. We're going to take those people and work out ways for them to do something constructive. That isn't saying explicitly that the goal of that program is to supplant and to make obsolete that private initiative that happens in that intermediate sector. But it is separate. It operates on a separate logic. And so to go to your point about transforming the idea of work, when we're not operating on principles of does this help enforce the rule of law or keep a core government need? Is this critical for national security? Or we're not operating on does this meet market logic? Is it profitable? Is it sustainable on those grounds? If we're operating on a different logic, which is this better than letting human beings waste away? That is a much broader scope of value. We don't have to make this the first thing that we think about when we get out of bed, but it can be the thing before throwing people away. And that space is a lot wider. It's stuff that could be nice to do that isn't essential, or it could be stuff that some people consider essential that not everyone is convinced about. And so it's sort of like someone has you're in an organization and someone says, I've got this great idea, and you say, okay, if we have time at the end of the day, if we have some spare time, if someone has a bit of spare labor at the end of this project, maybe we can try it out. This is those kinds of things. You try them out, they become proof of concept, then you can make the case why they could become part of a permanent expanded public sector. To go way out there, in Taiwan and other places I've heard, there are people who give sort of massages and physical intimacy to people who are either very lonely or have physical disabilities. That idea might be way outside the scope of certain cultures' conceptions of healthcare, right? The idea of getting cuddling as a healthcare system or getting prescribed art therapy as a healthcare system. Those ideas are things that whole communities need to actually have a lived experience with to change their mind about in a lot of situations. And being able to say, look, we're not forcing this to become the sort of premier standard for public institutions, but we're going to provide a space for experimentation and proof of concept and things. We can go a lot further. And most basically, to answer your question, when you're not driven by the profit motive, you don't have the same restrictions. You don't have the same requirements to prove financial viability. Whole kinds of care work right now that are currently informalized. What you're doing in this situation is you're opening up a new way of asking for investment. Right now, if I go to a bank and say, I've got this great idea, it's going to be really empowering for X oppressed community in my area, their answer is, that's great, is it profitable? Or maybe does it meet one of our statutory requirements for community inclusion? But let's say we tick those off for the month. Is it profitable? If you can go to this place and say, it isn't profitable, but we have 15 people who want to do it, that might be in and of itself enough of an argument why it's worth doing. So the vote goes from what's your financial business plan to what's your social impact. And that that is an empowering statement because different people are able to talk in language of social impact in their community. And you saw this, Pavlina Chernovo, one of the MMT economists who's done a lot of work on how to design these programs, went to Argentina when they set up their Jefes and Jefas program, and it was originally going to be for male heads of households. And women demanded access to the program, and they started creating childcare cooperatives and other forms of community organisations that gave them an independent source of income. And eventually that was actually, unfortunately, one of the reasons I got shut down, because it was sort of almost too empowering in that way that it wasn't intended to be. But that idea of you set it up and you open up that possibility of coming to apply, and new forms of groups will be able to come together and ask for access to the basic means of investment that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and in doing so can transform what we consider to be valuable.